Pleased to meet you. Hope you guessed my name. But what's puzzling you is the nature of my game.
The problem of evil. The problem of evil is an argument that purports to prove that God does not exist. It's called a problem because most of the people who paid attention to it have been religious believers, and they experienced the argument as a problem for their faith. Had atheists named it, they probably would have called it the ateleological argument or something like that, but they didn't. And you've heard the basic idea of the argument not only in class but many times before. If God is so great, then why is the world that he made so awful? But what we want to do is to state the idea as precisely as we can to make a valid argument that concludes that God doesn't exist. Remember that a valid argument is one in which the premises cannot be true without the conclusion also being true. The premises of a valid argument don't have to be true, and so neither does its conclusion. But if we have a valid argument showing that God doesn't exist, then that forces us to either accept the conclusion or reject at least one premise. And it will turn out that the atheist can come up with some premises that many religious believers very much want to accept, but that imply that God doesn't exist. So the believer either won't get everything that she wants, or will have to introduce a lot of real serious subtlety and sophistication into her religious convictions. In this video, I am going to speak as though I'm trying to prove that God doesn't exist. And I am not trying to prove that. I'm trying to explore the logic of God, the world, and their relationship. The problem of evil is a very serious challenge to faith, so I'm pointing out a challenge to faith. But don't misunderstand that to mean that I am challenging your faith. The last step of the problem of evil is a simple modus tollens inference. If God exists, then the actual world would be among the best of all possible worlds. But the actual world is not among the best of all possible worlds, so God doesn't exist. Setting aside what the premises of the conclusion are actually about, this argument is of the form, the logical form, if P then Q, but it is not the case at Q, so it is not the case that P. That's a standard modus tollens argument. Every argument of that form is valid, so the last step of the problem of evil is valid, whatever it's about. If its premises are true, then its conclusion must be true. The argument is expressed in terms of possible worlds and their qualities. So what is a possible world? We can start with the idea of a fact. A fact is a way that something is. It's a fact, for instance, that the Eiffel Tower exists. Existing is a way that the Eiffel Tower is in a way that, for instance, Atlantis isn't. It's a fact that the Eiffel Tower is in Paris. It could have been in Berlin, but it isn't. It's a fact that it's so and so many feet high, and so forth. It's a fact that Paris exists. It's a fact that it's in France. It's a fact that it's a scene of revolutionary violence, and so forth. It's a fact that the moon exists. It's a fact that it's made of various kinds of rocks and minerals, and so forth. It's a fact that 2 + 3 is 5. It's also a fact that there are a certain number of grains of sand in the Sahara Desert at the moment. Of course, nobody knows what that number is. If you take all of the facts, the ones that people know, and the ones that we don't know, and the ones that we will never know, and even the ones that we never could know, then you have the actual world. The world is all of the facts. If you take all of the ways that the world is and put them together, then you get the world, the whole thing, the actual world. But for some of those facts, we can understand how the world would have been had they been different. For instance, the Eiffel Tower is 1,063 feet tall. That is a fact. That is a way that things are in the actual world. But we can understand how things would have been had the Eiffel Tower been 1,064 feet tall. So it makes sense to say something like, imagine a world in which the Eiffel Tower was 1,064 feet tall. Do you want to live in a world in which the Eiffel Tower was 1,064 feet tall? That'd be a world much like ours, but one fact from the actual world would be missing, and another fact would be added. There'd have to be a few other differences too. The weight of the Eiffel Tower would be slightly different, for instance. But we can say that a world in which the Eiffel Tower is 1,064 feet tall is a possible world. Such a world is a set of facts just as extensive as the actual world, and those facts are internally consistent. Any such set of facts is a possible world. We often encounter other possible worlds in fiction. Middle-earth is a possible world. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, is a possible world. There are plenty of possible worlds in which Hitler won World War II. There are possible worlds in which Hitler would have won World War II had Superman not stopped him. There are possible worlds in which Superman would have stopped Hitler had Batman not gone fascist and gotten in Superman's way, and so forth, etc. Any time it is consistent and kind of extensive, it is a possible world. Lots of possible worlds are comparable in terms of quality. For instance, the last time that you set off on a bike, you pushed off with your left foot or your right foot. Had you pushed off with the other foot instead, it doesn't seem like that would have been better or worse. So the worlds in which you did don't seem to be better or worse than the actual world. On the other hand, some worlds seem to be better or worse than other worlds. The last time that you set off on a bike, you probably didn't accidentally slice your ankle on the chain or something, but worlds in which you did accidentally slice your ankle seem as though they would be worse than the actual world. At any rate, you must think that those worlds are worse because you put effort into not being in them. You put effort into not getting sliced up. So the problem of evil is an argument involving issues about the quality of the actual world and contrasting that with the capacities and intentions of God. The idea is that if God exists, then the actual world ought to be among the best of all possible worlds, but it isn't, so he doesn't. So now we have an idea, a little vague, but an idea of what the argument says. We know that it's valid. If its premises are true, then its conclusion must be true too. So if you accept the premises, then you have already implicitly accepted the conclusion. And if you reject the conclusion, then you've already implicitly rejected at least one of the premises. So what we want to know is there any reason to accept the premises? Is this argument not just valid, but also sound? The premises of this last step of the argument are themselves the conclusions of other arguments. So if those arguments are sound, then the premises of this last step of the argument are true, in which case the conclusion of it is true and God doesn't exist. So we should look at the arguments for the premises.
So let's look here at the first premise. The first premise is, if God exists, then the actual world is among the best of all possible worlds. Why should we accept that? What reason do we have to accept that that claim is true? Well, God, as traditionally conceived, has three features that seem to require that if he exists, then the actual world must be among the best of all possible worlds. The first of these properties is that God, by definition, or by nature, is the creator of all that is. If there were something that were just exactly like God in every way, but hadn't created the universe, the actual world, then it doesn't seem like that thing would be God. For the purposes of our argument, we're going to say that being the creator of the actual world is a necessary condition on something's being God, and this is how we say that. If God exists, then God is the creator of the actual world. That's another way of saying that if something is God, if anything is God, then that thing is the creator of the actual world. The second of these properties that God has that seem to be really important for the problem of evil is omnibenevolence. God, as traditionally conceived, is good. He does whatever he does as well as he can. If he could make it perfect, what he makes is perfect. Now, it might not look perfect to us, but it is perfect given its actual purpose and its full context, and we don't always know the purpose or the context. But the whole of creation doesn't have a context, and that's what we're interested in. So without saying anything about what a good world would be, we can express the idea that God is omnibenevolent and apply that idea to our argument by saying that if God exists, then, if God is the creator of the actual world, then the actual world is one of the best worlds that God could create. And again, that's just another way of partly defining God. It's a way of saying that if anything is God, then if it makes something, then it makes it as well as it can, and just applying that idea to a possible world, to the world as a whole. The third property that God has that's relevant to the problem of evil is omnipotence. God is omnipotent. He has all power. God, as traditionally conceived, is mighty. There's nothing that he cannot do. For our argument, the significance of this fact is that the best worlds that God can make are the best worlds. There are no worlds so good that God could not make them, no worlds too good for God to be able to make. So we can express the idea of God's omnipotence and apply it to our argument by saying that if God exists, then if a world is among the best possible worlds that God can create, then that world is among the best of all possible worlds. Now, we're trying to prove a conditional claim. We're trying to prove that if God exists, then the actual world is among the best of all possible worlds. That conditional claim is implicit in those three claims about God. To show that the conditional is true, we assume that God exists, draw some implications from that assumption, and then remind ourselves that we had only assumed that God exists for sake of argument. So we can begin with our assumption and our first premise. So we assume for sake of argument that God exists, and we can also say that by definition, if God exists, then God is the creator of the actual world. From those two claims, we can infer that God is the creator of the actual world. We've said that if God exists, then he's the creator of the actual world, and we've also assumed that God exists. Given our premise, when we assumed that God exists, we already implicitly assumed that God is the creator of the actual world. So now we can move on to the fact that God is omnibenevolent. So we can remind ourselves of our assumption that God exists. But further, we've said by definition that if God exists, then, if God is the creator of something, such as the actual world, then the something, such as the actual world, is one of the best possible somethings, in this case possible worlds, that God could create. From those two claims, we can infer that if God is the creator of the actual world, then the actual world is one of the best possible worlds that God could create. But we'd already shown that God is the creator of the actual world. So if we've agreed that God is the creator of the actual world, and we've agreed that if that's true, then the actual world is among the best, then we've already implicitly agreed that the actual world is among the best. So we can infer that the actual world is one of the best possible worlds that God could create. Now, for all that says, for all we know so far, it isn't a very good world, but we do know that God has done his best. We just don't know how good his best is yet. But now we can turn to God's omnipotence and find out what God's best is. So we remind ourselves of our assumption that God exists, and we restate our application of the claim that God is omnipotent. If God exists, then, if a world is among the best worlds that God can create, then that world is among the best of all possible worlds. There is no world greater than God can make. From those two claims, we can infer that if a world is among the best possible worlds that God can create, then that world is among the best of all possible worlds. But we'd already shown that the actual world is one of the best worlds that God could create. So now we've said that the actual world is one of these worlds, and that if it is one of those, then it must be among the best of all possible worlds. So obviously we can now infer that the actual world is among the best of all possible worlds. But we've only just been assuming that God exists for the sake of argument. So what we've actually shown is just that on that assumption, this is among the best of all possible worlds. But since we've only been just assuming that God exists, we haven't shown that this is among the best of all possible worlds. We've just shown that it's true on that assumption. So if God exists, then the actual world is among the best of all possible worlds. But that's what we wanted to prove. That was the first premise of the original argument. See, there it is, the first premise. But it's followed by the second premise. The actual world is not among the best of all possible worlds. So now we have an idea why we're supposed to accept the first premise. It's because of God's, by definition, being the creator, being omnipotent, and being omnibenevolent. But now why would we want to accept this second premise? The problem of evil turns on the observation that there is suffering in the world, and the assumption that other things being equal, suffering is bad. It states a condition on being a best possible world, a condition having to do with limitations on suffering or on kinds of suffering. But we can't argue straight from the fact that there's suffering in the world to the conclusion that the world would be better off without that suffering, since suffering is only bad other things being equal. It seems like suffering is usually bad, but maybe it isn't always bad. Suffering that's deserved isn't as obviously bad as suffering that's undeserved. Maybe even it's good because it's just. And suffering that's constructive, for instance, suffering that teaches someone something useful, isn't as obviously bad as suffering that's unconstructive. But despite cases of suffering that might not be bad, it still seems that we can fairly state this condition on worlds being one of the best possible. We want to say that if a world is among the best of all possible worlds, then it contains no undeserved or unconstructive suffering. That just seems to be a natural condition on a world's being among the best. If it's got undeserved suffering in it, then it is unfair, and if it's got unconstructive suffering in it, then it just seems to be pointlessly painful. But it's hard to tell whether an instance of suffering is deserved or constructive. It would be deserved or not depending on the state of mind of the sufferer, and who can tell that? It would be constructive or not depending on its long-term consequences, but who knows that? The religious believer is within her rights to point out that only God could have the answer to those questions, and so we have no business making claims about the quality of the world. So the best version of the problem of evil isn't going to try to start with evidence here. Instead, it's going to start into this issue by thinking about compassion and moral constraint. It looks as though sometimes we ought to have compassion regarding the suffering of other people and maybe animals. But notice that the degree to which compassion seems called for looks like it correlates a bit with how undeserved or unconstructive the suffering seems to us to be. We feel compassion for the victim of a crime because of his suffering, but we don't feel particularly compassionate toward the criminal who suffers what we believe is a just punishment. We feel compassion for someone who suffers from a disease, but we don't necessarily feel the same kind of compassion for someone who suffers in what we think of as a healthy or constructive way. Sore muscles after a workout, for instance, don't inspire a lot of sympathy because they seem to us to be a natural consequence of something constructive, the workout. Now, we are free to say that that's all false and that we ought to feel compassion for everyone suffering, deserved or constructive or not, and that is fine. What we're trying to do is to get from the fact that there is suffering, and the fact that suffering is other things being equal bad, to the conclusion that the world is flawed. If we thought that all suffering were bad, then we should get to our conclusion just that much more quickly. So in talking about how compassion should be limited toward deserved or constructive suffering, we're actually making things harder for ourselves. The problem of evil would be all that much quicker an argument if even deserved or constructive suffering warranted compassion. So let's wonder what sort of compassion would be appropriate in a world in which all suffering was constructive or deserved, which, for all we know, we live in, since only God can really tell. Since compassion seems not to be warranted, at least as much, in the face of constructive or deserved suffering, such a world wouldn't be one in which it would make much sense to have compassion. So you get to believe that this world contains no bad suffering, but you'll have trouble working up compassion for people anymore. If you look at a natural disaster and you think that it's just God working his wonders in mysterious ways, and that something good will surely come of this, then why feel sorry for the victims? They aren't victims. Setting aside compassion, the problem of evil will also note that there are moral constraints on causing suffering. It is almost always wrong to cause suffering. But note that the exceptions, the cases where it seems like it might not be wrong to cause suffering, are the same ones that we've been thinking about. It isn't obviously wrong to cause deserved suffering. Causing wrongdoers to suffer might be part of the virtue of justice. And it isn't obviously wrong to cause constructive suffering. That might be part of education. But let's say that all suffering were deserved or constructive, which for all we know it is, since only God could really tell. In that case, any suffering that you could cause would be deserved or constructive. But in that case, the moral constraint on causing suffering would have no application. Whatever you did would turn out to be the right thing to do. The Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky has a character claim that if God does not exist, then anything is permitted. But the line of thought I've just offered suggests the reverse. On that line of thought, if God exists, then this is a perfect world, and anything that happens in a perfect world enhances its perfection. So whatever you end up doing, however brutal or vicious, would turn out to have been the right thing to do. So, if that line of thought is right, then it looks as though we can say that if compassion or moral constraint on causing suffering are warranted, then the actual world contains undeserved or unconstructive suffering. So, it seems that it remains only to point out the seemingly obvious that compassion and moral constraints on causing suffering are warranted. So, putting those two claims together, we can draw the inference that the actual world contains undeserved or unconstructive suffering. Bear in mind that we haven't presented evidence for this claim. We've just said that we think that compassion and morality make sense, and then stated a condition on their making sense. They wouldn't make sense in a perfect world, but they do make sense in ours, or at least we make sense of them, we like them, we think that they make sense, which looks like it implies that ours is not a perfect world, according to us. But as far as this argument is concerned, you are free to reject compassion and morality. I've just stated that compassion and morality make sense without argument. You can reject them if you want. So we can put that claim together with our earlier claim, our condition on a world's being among one of the best. We wanted to say that if a world is among the best of all possible worlds, then it contains no undeserved or unconstructive suffering. The exact kind of suffering that it looks like we've just shown, we think that there is in the actual world. So it looks as though implicit in what we have already said is the claim that the actual world is not among the best of all possible worlds. But that is what we wanted to prove. That's the second premise of the original argument. So here to remind ourselves is the original argument. If God exists, then the actual world is among the best of all possible worlds, but it isn't, so God doesn't exist. So the premises of this argument directly imply that God doesn't exist, and that means that the premises of the arguments for those premises indirectly imply that God doesn't exist. So to have accepted those premises, the premise that God is the creator, God is omnibenevolent, and God is omnipotent, that compassion and moral constraint on suffering are warranted in the actual world, seems that it's already to say that God doesn't exist implicitly. And also to say that God might exist is already to have rejected at least one of the premises of those arguments. The trouble is that those arguments seem very strong. The first one just points out that God is by definition the creator, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent. That's the traditional conception of God. The second one points out that there's suffering of a kind that warrants compassion and moral constraint, suffering that is bad, that we should try to avoid and that we should wish hadn't happened. The religious believer seems to be stuck saying that God isn't the creator, or God isn't good, or God isn't powerful, or else that compassion and moral constraint on causing suffering are a mistake. In short, if you accept the traditional definition of God, and you accept morality, then it's hard to accept that God exists. Of course, that is not the end of the matter. There are attempts to rebut the problem of evil. Attempts to refute the problem of evil are called theodicies. A theodicy is an attempt to refute the problem of evil and show that, for all we know, God might exist. It is not an attempt to show that God does exist. You can accept a theodicy, think that the problem of evil is not a sound argument, and also not accept that God exists. But a theodicy is supposed to open the space, the scope, for a possible proof for the existence of God, or for a possible faith. Now, if the problem of evil is sound, then God does not exist. So a theodicy will have to say that the argument is not sound. An argument is sound when it is valid, and its premises are true. So a theodicy will have to say that the argument is invalid, or has at least one false premise. But it is valid. So a theodicy will have to say that it has at least one false premise. Traditionally, there are two major attempts at theodicy. There are many variations on them, and there are a few other distinctive theodicies, but these are the ones that have gotten the most discussion. Here's the first one. It's called the free will defense. The free will defense suggests that maybe the argument is a little quick with the fact that God is the creator. Now, of course, God is the creator in some sense, but maybe he didn't create unnecessary or undeserved suffering. Maybe that's a part of the universe that God's not directly responsible for, or not responsible for at all. So how could that be? Maybe God is the creator in the following sense. He created matter and imposed physical law on it, thereby indirectly determining the entire course of the universe, with some exceptions. Because he also created things that, like himself, exercise independent creative power. And he somehow left some bubbles in the physical universe in which what had happened before doesn't determine what will happen next. That is, he left gaps in his creation, but he also created others to fill in those gaps as they saw fit. The other creators obviously are us. Our creative power is our free will. The bubbles are the scope for our own decisions. Now, it seems that on the account I just gave, God certainly counts as the creator of the universe. But that doesn't imply that God created each and every detail of the universe. So if all of the unnecessary and undeserved suffering were in the bubbles left empty by God, then God isn't responsible for them. Now, we could describe this as the claim that God didn't precisely create the world, or we could say that God's existence doesn't demand a world that is as good as a world can be, or we could deny that God has the power to create a best possible world on his own. A best possible world would be one in which other free beings contributed to the overall goodness. So the free will defense can be phrased in such a way as to reject any one of the three premises leading to the first claim of the major argument, the claim that if God exists, then this is among the best of all possible worlds. There are two standard responses to this theodicy. Here's the first one. The first one points out the difference between artificial and natural suffering. In addition to artificial or man-made suffering, suffering that's the predictable consequence of human action, there's an awful lot of natural suffering, suffering for which it seems that no one is responsible and which was not ours to prevent. All suffering in all animals prior to the evolution of humanity, for instance, is hardly our responsibility, and an awful lot of animal suffering is beyond our control now. And people suffer from horrible diseases and natural disasters that they did nothing to bring on. So it seems as though even if the story about free will is true, God would still have an awful lot to answer for. The second one of the responses is going to turn on the nature of free will. The free will defense requires that we be responsible for unconstructive and undeserved suffering, and it also requires that God not be responsible for it. But it isn't obvious that we actually have free will in the sense required by the free will defense. It isn't even obvious that what the free will defense is talking about is what we think of as free will. There are a couple of different theories about the nature of free will, and the free will defense really just raises as many questions about them as it answers about God. So here's the first of these theories about what free will is. We can call it the incompatibilist theory of the nature of free will. On this view, a person performs an act freely means the same as this. The person performs the act, but she could have done otherwise. On the incompatibilist theory about the nature of free will, we do freely what we could have refrained from doing. That's the kind of free will that we would have to have for the free will defense to go through. If we couldn't do otherwise than cause a bunch of undeserved and unconstructive suffering, because the fact that we would cause it was already determined at the beginning of time and we couldn't have done otherwise, then God is still on the hook for all of the suffering. But it isn't at all obvious that we have that kind of free will. Human bodies are physical objects, and they obey physical laws, and those laws don't appear to involve a lot of gaps or bubbles where things could have gone otherwise. Now, some of you might be thinking that the branch of physics known as quantum mechanics looks like it shows that there are a lot of gaps. But the weird effects in quantum mechanics seem to be isolated to individual subatomic particles. Once you get billions of those subatomic particles together for something like a human body, the mass acts in a totally deterministic fashion. Statistics governing the individuals ends up with determinism governing the mass. At any rate, we're not going to worry about that issue. On the other hand, here's another conception of free will. This is another definition of the very nature of free will. We'll call it compatibilism. On the compatibilist conception of free will, a person performs an act freely means the same as the person performed the act because of who she is, because of her own distinctive personality, character, deliberations, values, decisions, and so forth. On the compatibilist conception, acting freely is just doing what you yourself think best for your own reasons, where your reasons don't include things like violence or drugs. The fact that there's a gun to your head isn't really your reason. If you've been blasted out of your mind on some kind of mind-altering substance through no fault of your own, then again, it is not your character that's being expressed in your actions. On the compatibilist conception, for you to be free is for your character to be governing your actions. But it doesn't matter where your character came from. It could be that your character is itself determined by forces beyond your control, and you would still be responsible for what your character makes you do, for what you do in virtue of being the person that you are. In the context of the problem of evil, that means that God could have made you the kind of person who would freely cause some unconstructive and undeserved suffering, and you would still do it freely. It would be an expression of your character or personality. So you would be responsible for it, but it seems like God would also be indirectly responsible for it. The free will defense tries to shift responsibility from God to us, but if compatibilism is true, then free will just multiplies the responsibility rather than shifting it. There are reasons both to accept and reject each of these conceptions of free will, but one serious issue with incompatibilism is that if it's true, then it looks as if we might not have free will, because we are physical objects obeying physical laws. So to offer the free will defense, someone would have to defend the incompatibilist conception of free will, and also prove that we are free by that standard, the laws of physics apparently notwithstanding. That is a fairly difficult and demanding set of philosophical problems to solve. So, setting those problems aside for another time, I want to go ahead and move on to the other most common historical theodicy. It goes by an awful lot of names. The name that I use is the beautiful tapestry defense. The free will defense tried to show that God could exist even if the world is not among the best possible. It was an attempt to undermine the first premise of the problem. The beautiful tapestry defense tries to undermine the second premise by contending that for all we know, this is actually among the best of all possible worlds, because for all we know, it contains no unconstructive or undeserved suffering. The name appeals to an analogy. We can imagine that there is a beautiful tapestry or painting or whatnot, and if you look at just a tiny piece of it, you might think that you're seeing something hideous. But if you could back up a bit and take a broader view, you would see not only that the little bit that you could see wasn't ugly, but that it somehow contributed to the beauty of the whole. In the analogy, the universe is the tapestry. Our perspective is too close and allows us to see too little to really judge the beauty of the whole. God's is the perspective that is backed up and broader. Since we lack the appropriate perspective, we will never be in a position to judge that the universe is good or bad or anything else on our own. But if we have reason to believe that God exists, and we have reason to believe that He would only create one among the best of all possible worlds, then we would indirectly know that this world is among the best. But note that the argument for the claim that this is not among the best of all possible worlds didn't mention any evidence at all. It began with compassion and moral constraint. The beautiful tapestry defense appears to be saying that we have no evidence that compassion or moral constraint are warranted. That might be true, but the beautiful tapestry defense is asking us to give up an awful lot to allow God into our worldview. It's asking us to abandon compassion, morality, self-control, any kind of striving or concern for the good, since the good will be achieved anyway, no matter what we do. Whatever we do will have been for the best in this best of all possible worlds. Thus, the beautiful tapestry defense appears to find itself in the ironic position of trading away morality to get God. That's ironic because many people think that God and morality go hand in hand. Now, obviously, all of these issues would need to be explored in much greater depth. I'm leaving them off here, not because I've settled them all, certainly, but because we have what we need for the purpose of our class, and because further details would be very complicated and probably a little confusing. I hope that you have enjoyed this.